a bag of Skittles, a can of iced tea, a hoodie in the rain. These ordinary things would become symbols of a tragedy that changed America. It would take 44 days for an arrest. It would take a national movement to demand justice. But it would take only seconds for George Zimmerman to end Trayvon Martin's life. On the evening of February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old black teenager, was walking back from a convenience store in Sanford, Florida. He had stopped to buy Skittles and an iced tea, his favorite snack combination, before returning to the home of his father's fiancée, where he was staying during a school suspension. The night was quiet, with a light rain falling, and Trayvon wore a dark hoodie and jeans, blending into the shadows of the suburban streets. He had no idea he was being watched. The 911 call. George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old man living in the same gated community, was sitting in his car as a volunteer neighborhood watch coordinator. Zimmerman had been actively involved in monitoring the area for several years, frequently calling 911 about suspicious people. Records later showed that he had made 46 calls over the previous year, almost all concerning black males in the neighborhood. That evening, Zimmerman spotted Trayvon walking and called 911 to report a suspicious person. On the call, Zimmerman expressed frustration, saying, "These assholes always get away," and used what some heard as a racial slur, reported by some listeners as "fing coons" and disputed by others as "fing punks." He described Trayvon as looking black, a detail that would later factor heavily into discussions about racial profiling and the perception of threat. The 911 dispatcher asked what Trayvon was doing that seemed suspicious. Zimmerman couldn't give a clear answer. The teenager was just walking, in the rain, going home. But Zimmerman decided that wasn't enough. He told the dispatcher he was getting out of his vehicle to follow Trayvon. The dispatcher's response was clear and direct. "We don't need you to do that." Zimmerman ignored the instruction. The pursuit. Zimmerman began following Trayvon on foot. The pursuit continued for several minutes through the quiet suburban streets. During this time, Trayvon was on the phone with his friend Rachel Jeantel. She later testified that she heard Trayvon speaking to someone, asking why they were following him. His voice sounded frightened. She heard him say, "Why are you following me?" and heard a man's voice respond, though she couldn't make out the words. Then she heard sounds of a physical confrontation, breathing, movement, struggling. The phone went dead. Rachel immediately tried calling back. Trayvon didn't answer. The confrontation. Multiple neighbors heard yelling and a struggle from inside the gated community where the confrontation took place. Several called 911, and their calls captured something chilling, agonizing screams for help in the background. The recordings would become some of the most contested evidence at trial. Audio experts were brought in to analyze the voice. Trayvon's family identified the screams as their son's, begging for his life. Zimmerman's family claimed it was George, crying out in fear. The jury would have to decide who was screaming for help in those final moments. Then, a single gunshot. The screaming stopped. Police arrived minutes later to find Trayvon Martin on the ground with a gunshot wound to the chest. He was face down in the grass, unarmed, with only Skittles and iced tea in his pockets. George Zimmerman was standing nearby with his firearm. He had injuries consistent with a physical altercation, cuts on the back of his head and a swollen, broken nose. His defense would later argue these injuries proved Trayvon had mounted him and was beating his head against the concrete, justifying lethal force. The prosecution would counter that the injuries were minor. Zimmerman had declined an ambulance and was treated with simple bandages, and didn't justify shooting an unarmed teenager to death. Forensic evidence later revealed that Trayvon's DNA was found on Zimmerman's clothing and hands, consistent with a physical struggle. Zimmerman's DNA was found on Trayvon as well, confirming contact during the fight. But only one person could tell the story of what happened. The other was dead. 44 days of silence. The Sanford Police Department initially did not arrest George Zimmerman. They accepted his claim of self-defense without a thorough investigation. The lead investigator, Chris Serino, reportedly wanted to charge Zimmerman with manslaughter that night, but was overruled by the state attorney's office. Zimmerman was questioned, then released. For 44 days, he remained free while Trayvon Martin's body lay in a morgue, initially unidentified because police didn't check his phone for emergency contacts. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, became central figures in advocating for justice for their son. When the Sanford police refused to act, they retained attorney Benjamin Crump to press for Zimmerman's arrest. They held press conferences. They organized rallies. They refused to let their son's death be dismissed. Public protests began to swell. Hashtags such as #JusticeForTrayvon trended on social media, and debates about racial profiling, gun laws, and Florida's Stand Your Ground statute intensified across the nation. The Hoodie-Trayvon War became a symbol of racial injustice. Supporters across the country, including members of Congress and professional athletes, donned hoodies in solidarity, transforming a piece of clothing into a statement. Black children have the right to walk home safely. The pressure mounted. The case could no longer be ignored. On April 11, 2012, 44 days after the shooting, George Zimmerman was finally arrested and charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter. The trial began in June 2013 under Special Prosecutor Angela Corey. The courtroom was packed. The nation watched. The case revolved around the question of whether Zimmerman had acted in self-defense and whether he had provoked the confrontation that led to Trayvon's death. Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe it is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm, played a central role in the jury instructions. While Zimmerman's defense didn't formally invoke Stand Your Ground in pretrial hearings, the law was included in the instructions given to the jury, fundamentally shaping how they could interpret the events. The prosecution's case. The prosecution presented evidence to show that Zimmerman had ignored the dispatcher's instructions, pursued Trayvon without justification, and initiated the confrontation. They emphasized Zimmerman's 911 call history, 46 calls in 1 year, almost all about black males, suggesting a pattern of racial bias and predisposition to see black people as threats. Rachel Jeantel testified about her phone conversation with Trayvon. She described his fear, his confusion about why a stranger was following him, and the sounds of confrontation she heard before the line went dead. Under intense cross-examination, the defense attempted to discredit her testimony, but she remained steadfast. Trayvon was afraid, and Zimmerman had pursued him. Other neighbors provided accounts of screams and sounds of struggle, corroborating that a violent physical confrontation had occurred. The prosecution argued that Trayvon Martin had every right to defend himself against an armed stranger who had been stalking him through the neighborhood. They pointed out that Trayvon was the one who should have felt threatened, not Zimmerman, the armed adult who had initiated the pursuit. The defense's case. The defense argued that Trayvon had attacked Zimmerman without provocation, forcing him to shoot in self-defense. George Zimmerman testified that he had lost sight of Trayvon and was walking back to his vehicle when Trayvon suddenly appeared, confronted him, and punched him in the face. He claimed Trayvon then mounted him, slammed his head against the concrete sidewalk, and reached for his gun. Fearing for his life, Zimmerman said he had no choice but to fire. The defense presented Zimmerman's injuries as proof of the assault. They played portions of the 911 calls in slow motion, analyzing the screams to suggest they were Zimmerman's cries for help. They questioned whether Rachel Jeantel could accurately perceive events over the phone and suggested that Trayvon may have been the initial aggressor, though no witnesses directly saw how the confrontation began. The verdict. The jury deliberated for more than 16 hours over 2 days. On July 13, 2013, they returned their verdict. Not guilty of second-degree murder. Not guilty of manslaughter. The courtroom fell silent. Outside, crowds who had gathered erupted, some in disbelief, others in outrage. Trayvon's parents sat devastated, holding each other as they absorbed the reality that the man who killed their son would walk free. The defense had successfully argued self-defense under Florida law. The prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Zimmerman had acted with ill will, hatred, or spite, the legal standard for second-degree murder in Florida. But for millions of Americans, the verdict felt like a failure of justice. An unarmed black teenager had been killed while walking home. The man who pursued him, ignored police instructions, and shot him was acquitted. The verdict sparked nationwide protests. It renewed scrutiny of racial profiling, self-defense statutes, and the criminal justice system's treatment of black victims. The case highlighted how the perception of threat is often influenced by race, and how legal frameworks can complicate or prevent the pursuit of justice. The federal investigation. In the aftermath, the Department of Justice opened a federal civil rights investigation to determine whether Zimmerman had violated Trayvon's civil rights by targeting him because of his race. Federal investigators reviewed all the evidence, the 911 calls, witness testimony, Zimmerman's history, and forensic reports. Ultimately, the DOJ declined to bring federal hate crime charges against Zimmerman, citing insufficient evidence to prove racial bias beyond a reasonable doubt. While Zimmerman's actions raised serious questions about racial profiling, prosecutors determined they could not meet the high legal standard required for a federal conviction. The decision was another blow to Trayvon's family and supporters, who believed justice had been denied at both the state and federal levels. The aftermath. In the years following his acquittal, George Zimmerman remained a controversial and troubling figure. He was arrested multiple times for domestic violence incidents and threatening behavior toward partners and others. He auctioned the gun he used to kill Trayvon Martin, selling it for $250,000 to an undisclosed buyer who he claimed wanted it as a piece of American history. His actions after the trial only deepened the public's conviction that justice had not been served. Meanwhile, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin continued their advocacy. They spoke publicly about their son, urging legislative reform and supporting initiatives to prevent similar tragedies. They became voices for parents across the country who had lost children to gun violence and racial profiling. Sabrina Fulton later ran for public office, driven by a desire to create systemic change and honor her son's memory through action. The movement. Trayvon Martin's death had profound cultural and social impacts that extended far beyond the courtroom. The case inspired Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi to create the Black Lives Matter movement, aimed at addressing systemic racism and violence against Black people. What began as a hashtag in response to Zimmerman's acquittal grew into a global movement demanding accountability, justice, and reform. Nationwide, communities reevaluated neighborhood watch programs, questioning whether armed civilians should take enforcement into their own hands. Conversations about racial profiling intensified in schools, workplaces, and police departments. The hoodie Trayvon wore that rainy night became more than clothing. It became a symbol of solidarity, of resistance, of the right to exist without suspicion. It represented every Black person who had been followed in a store, stopped on the street, or assumed to be dangerous simply because of the color of their skin. A comparison, Trayvon and Ahmaud. Like Ahmaud Arbery 8 years later, Trayvon Martin was pursued by an armed man who assumed the worst based on the color of his skin. Like Ahmaud, Trayvon was doing nothing wrong, just existing in a space where someone decided he didn't belong. But unlike Ahmaud's killers, George Zimmerman walked free. The difference in outcomes highlights how justice in America can hinge on video evidence, public pressure, the prosecutors who handle the case, and the laws that govern self-defense. Ahmaud's case had clear video showing the pursuit and shooting. Trayvon's case had only conflicting accounts and 911 audio. Both cases exposed the same truth. For too many Black people in America, simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or being perceived as suspicious, can be a death sentence. It is a story about race and perception, about fear and bias, about the consequences of choices made in moments of suspicion and assumption. Trayvon Martin was more than a name in a headline. He was a teenager with friends, family, dreams, and a future. He loved football. He made his family laugh. He was 17 years old, walking home with Skittles and iced tea when his life was taken. The pursuit of justice for Trayvon did not end with a verdict. It continues through advocacy, education, and the ongoing conversation about equality, safety, and accountability. Even years later, Trayvon's legacy resonates. The voices of his parents, witnesses, and community activists remain central to discussions about racial justice. His death exposed systemic inequalities and prompted a movement that continues to fight for change. The Trayvon Martin case reminds the nation that true justice involves more than a verdict. It requires confronting uncomfortable truths, acknowledging bias, and working to prevent the circumstances that allow such tragedies to happen. Trayvon Martin deserved to make it home that night. He deserved to grow up, to live his life, to chase his dreams. This is his story. To explore more stories like this, where human choices, justice, and society collide, subscribe to Storysphere. Stay informed, stay aware, and never forget the lessons that lives, law, and history can teach us.